starting this week with this new article that I've put together. It's called Enclosure for Empire. And it's looking at really the main part of the article is a timeline, really, looking right the way back from 1118, with the founding of the Templars after the First Crusade, right the way through to the Glorious Revolution in 1688, the William of Orange lands at Torbay with 14,000 soldiers. But anyway, I'm going to try and run through it reasonably chronologically, and Martin, if you want to chip in, correct me on various factual errors, and I can make a little note and double-check it, and then maybe even sub it. The subtitle of the article is The Bankrupt Brewer of Huntingdon and Solomon's Temple, an untold story of the English Civil War. Now, the Bankrupt Brewer of Huntingdon refers to who, Martin?
I presume you're talking about Oliver Cromwell.
Oliver Cromwell, that's right. Well, what I'm trying to do, I suppose, here is show that he wasn't really anything special, although there's lots of people on the left that seem to think Cromwell was some sort of hero for killing the king. There's all sorts of other aspects to the Civil War, which mean, I mean, for example, the way that Cromwell massacred the Levellers at Levellers Day when we went back in May this year down to Burford in Oxfordshire, where the Levellers Day is organised. Lots of the lefties there were sort of backing Cromwell, even though it was Cromwell that ordered the 3 heroic martyrs from the Levellers outside Burford Church to be shot for mutiny because they wouldn't go to Ireland and fight the Irish for him. But they still somehow make out that Cromwell was some sort of hero. Anyway, so this is really a look at the origins of the 1642 to 1649 English Civil War, many of which have been established by historians and university departments over the centuries. Central to their tenets are the grievances over Charles's arbitrary rule and the 3 monopolies of church, printing and trade. So the idea that the church was very strictly and rigorously controlled and everybody had to go to church, but it was all completely controlled from the top down by the new Church of England. Then we also have printing. Also, anyone that wanted to print anything had to get it licensed first. And so what happened was printing presses were liberated, and some pamphlets, etc., back in the Civil War, many of them were printed on these so-called illegal presses. Printing was another monopoly they hated, and trade, often called ship money, where the king was said to be putting on too many taxes onto trade. He was doing this, of course, because he'd fallen out with Parliament and he needed to raise some money.
Ship money.
Ship money, that's right.
Ship money was actually money that had always been ship money in the ports to pay for the Royal Navy, but ship money was extended to the inland areas, which they'd never previously paid.
Well, hang on, the ships can't go inland.
No, that's why the inland areas said, hang on a minute, this is a non-traditional tax on us, because the ship money was there was a traditional. It was traditionally allowed for the king to levy ship money in ports, but right. he then extended it to inland because he was doing it without Parliament's approval, and of course that then led to John Hampden's rebellion. He was eventually imprisoned and so on. So it wasn't the ship money thing; was about the funding of the navy. Right.
So I mean, you could even go back to the Norman invasion, 1066. And look at the tensions between the new Norman rulers and the previous Saxon rulers. But we're not really going to do that tonight. Of course, when they imposed the Doomsday Book, which was named after the Day of Judgment. I mean, people said this is the Day of Doom, and they were sending a warning to us today saying this Doomsday Book's terrible, where they went around taking an inventory of all the land. There were riots around the country, even back before then. So the whole issue of the land, which is one of my main tenets in the article, is I think absolutely at the heart of what was going on in the English Civil War. So one of the most important things about the Civil War, Martin, I think you can definitely comment on this, is in the 1960s and the 1970s there were people like Brailsford and Christopher Hill writing about the Civil War in a way, elucidating stuff from original pamphlets from the time, doing their own research after the Second World War that had really never done before.
Yeah, I mean, previously, I think S.P. Gardner was regarded as the sort of Whig historian of the era, but Christopher Hill, who was Master of Balliol, he was a communist, basically. He was in the Communist Party, and there was he very much pushed the idea that the English Civil War was a bourgeois revolution to create a capitalist society, and he saw it as analogous with the French Revolution or the American Revolution. It's still a very influential analysis, and of course Brailsford and others talk to Rawls about the levellers.
But what about Marx? Because he also said quite a lot about this whole agrarian problem. The idea that suddenly people had no land of their own, they couldn't grow their own food, they had to go and work in factories. Marx is very big on this.
Yes, but you've got to remember, when you say that they were the enclosure was the removal of people's right to the use of the land. The land never belonged to them. The land always belonged to the landlord classes. So the idea that there was some kind of peasant utopia before enclosure is wrong.
Well,
these people were serfs.
I think they weren't. No, they weren't serfs.
Mostly they were.
They had a very important thing, that is security of tenure. So they couldn't be evicted.
No, they didn't. I mean, this is one of the things.
They had a thing called copyhold back in those days,
but
where their kids would always just take on their
copyholders were not necessarily the majority of the peasantry. Yeah. So there's always, the ownership of the land was always very highly concentrated, but the rules around use of the land were allowed usufruct to people who were born in the parish.
For example, the Earl couldn't sell the land. I mean, because they had all these sitting tenants everywhere.
What they could do is that one Earl gets his head chopped off for treason, and another Earl takes over that piece of land.
That's right.
According to what the Crown decides.
That's right. The Crown
but the people just get shunted from one to the other. They never got a say in any of it.
No, that's absolutely right. But there was a big change during Enclosure. Anyway, so we go back to my little timeline. It also looks at the fact that you've got the witchcraft trials going on after the Reformation. So if we start, though, with the Vatican founding the Knights Templar after the First Crusade in 1118, then we look at the big split that went on between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church in 1154, not long after. But then within around about 90 or 100 years of the Templars being founded, then there was suddenly this massive battle between Orthodox Constantinople and on Rome, with the sacking of Constantinople. So it was almost as if this whole idea of the Templars was a complete ruse by Rome to charge in the direction of the Orthodox Church. And actually they ended up destroying Constantinople. That didn't destroy the Orthodox Church, but it wasn't a very friendly or Christian thing for them to do. Then in 1312, the Templar Order was extinguished by the Vatican. 1348, we saw, and this is one of the things that's prompted me to do this week, is the founding of this Order of the Garter. So that was, I think I said 50 years last week, but it's actually more like 25 years after the Templars were extinguished in 1312. But apparently, one of the things I was reading is that there was never an order extinguishing the Templars by the Scottish king in Scotland. So it could well be that the Templars went from their main port in La Rochelle, just sailed up to Edinburgh, and especially if they'd had word of what the French king was up to. So we'd have the founding of the Order of the Garter in 1348 in Woodstock in Oxfordshire with 26 knights. The legend is the motto, "Shame on anyone who thinks this is evil," originated when the Countess of Salisbury, dancing with the king, dropped her garter and he gallantly picked it up. However, in her 1921 anthropological study of witchcraft, Margaret Murray says the garter is a hidden emblem of a witchcraft high priestess, indicating control of a coven of 13, and that the king may have simply been demonstrating his support for her. Then in 1381 we had the Peasants' Revolt after that, which is believed to have been orchestrated by the underground Templars. Now a lot of this stuff is in, and the links between Freemasonry and the Templars are in John Robinson's book, which I cite at the end. It's called Born in Blood, Lost Secrets of Freemasonry, published in 1989. So the Peasants' Revolt, a lot of the Templar property which had been handed over to the Knights Hospitaller was confiscated, and also or destroyed, burnt down. That sort of thing happened during the Peasants' Revolt. They threatened the Templars, threatened the boy king Richard II, using the peasants, and also they were regaining and destroying property they'd lost previously. So then also, after that, 1446, Rosslyn Chapel was built in Midlothian, southwest of the ex-Templar port Edinburgh, by Sir William St. Clair. Then we had, between the 1450s and the 1480s, was the Wars of the Roses, these dynastic battles over 30 years, tied up with England losing control of its then French territories, The sides symbolised by the white Lancastrian and the red Yorkshire 5-pointed roses. And after the Battle of Bosworth, at the end of it in 1487, England settled down a bit. There'd been all these bands of brigands around all over the place, and things started to get a bit calmer. I mean, obviously, this is medieval times. It's not totally calm. Then we started to have loads of a series of depopulation acts put down. This one is under Henry VII, against the pulling down of towns, because this whole idea of enclosure was starting to gain track. The idea of basically just evicting peasants from their cottages and using the stones from those cottages to build your own place, maybe a manor house or whatever, but then turning all that land over to sheep. So this is the whole idea of privatisation of land, of enclosure. And this 1489 was the first act of Parliament and the King, signed off by the King, to try and put a stop to this, so they could see lots of people were being made homeless. Then we had 1492 and 97, the so-called discovery of South America and the Caribbean by Columbus, and North America by John Cabot sailing out of Bristol here. Now, I do say here, there's evidence that these places have already been discovered, and this really was just a way to prepare the public for what was to be centuries of colonisation from Europe. Then we've got more depopulation acts in the early 1500s, royal anti-enclosure commissions in 15, 16, 18 and 19. So lots being done to try and address this issue. But then there was a recognition after a while that the people who were being asked to stop enclosures were the people who were benefiting from the enclosures. So a lot of these acts of parliament were getting absolutely nowhere. 1534, an act to try to stop sheep farming, the Sheep Farming Restraining Act, things like that, more depopulation acts. But then we come across the Reformation. Between 1536 and 1541, you had the dissolution of the monasteries by Cromwell's great-grandfather. Well, Oliver Cromwell's great-grandfather, and Henry VIII's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. So that's 900 religious businesses and institutions are nationalised and sold off. 12,000 in religious orders are sacked. And the debt the Crown owes to these monastic institutions, with tens of billions of pounds in 2022 currency, is all cancelled. Well, that's handy, isn't it? Henry VIII hasn't got to pay anything to these monasteries. The Reformation is beginning in earnest, really, with an attack on the commercial operation of the church. In fact, the destruction of it, because they had been a very important part of the commerce of the nation. The church had been doing these things. They were doing education, libraries, hospitals, this sort of thing, via these various monastic institutions, all then taken over by the Crown. So then in 1542, because of the kicking out of the Vatican by Henry VIII, they passed England's first capital Witchcraft Act, removing jurisdiction from the church courts to the Crown courts and assizes to prosecute witchcraft. And of course, so various these witch trials started. And also in the 1500s, 1549, there was a thing called Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk over enclosure. East Anglia was ruled for 7 weeks from under an oak tree by Robert Kett and 16,000 peasants. The enclosers were locked up. That's the people who'd been evicting the peasants, were all locked up in Norwich jail for stealing the land. And King Edward the Sixth's army is twice turned back by the rebels, but then reinforced and finally defeats them. So that's in Norfolk in 1549. So we've got more depopulation acts, more and more. This is all as you can see, in the build-up to the Civil War. There's a battle going on here over whether or not you can privatise land and kick all the peasants off to go and work cheaply, and so that they're dependent on you, basically, more and more dependent on you. You're slaves. Depopulation Act in 1563 repeals all the previous depopulation acts as ineffective, and as I say, they're realising that there's no point in passing these laws, because the people who are going to actually bring the laws into effect are benefiting personally from enclosure. Pointless. And then in 1563, there's a post-Reformation Witchcraft Act passed in Scotland, which makes witchcraft or consulting with witches a capital crime. Now, these acts to do with witchcraft are coming in because of the Reformation, because the Vatican is no longer around, and people perceive that this is something that the church, that the state has to deal with, that the church has not dealt with. Elizabeth I's Witchcraft Act is in 1563. She very sensibly reduces the penalties for witchcraft because, we don't really want witch hunts just chasing after people without proper evidence, except it remains a capital offence only for those proven to have also caused harm. So you can't just say, I saw such and such with the devil. They've also got to have been proved to have caused harm. And if they have, then that's a proven case. So Elizabeth I reined back the initial witch hunts of Henry VIII. Then one of the most interesting aspects of all of this is in 1577, John Dee, who was Elizabeth I's advisor, privately published something called the Vision for, it was a vision for the ascendancy of a projected British Empire, advised by Christopher Hatton and Robert Dudley. For Elizabeth I's general and rare, the book's title is A General and Rare Memorial pertaining to the perfect art of navigation. Through part of Dee's plan, Elizabeth claims privateers Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh and John Hawkins are not working for the Crown, but actually, of course, they are. The idea is here that, Dee's idea really is that if Britain can really be vicious and on the seas, on the high seas with the Royal Navy and various other third parties and other hidden actors, that Britain can then start up having an empire and beat the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the other European powers who are starting to build up empires. And for further information on that, there's some excellent articles at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich by the Deputy Curator Alex Grover. So then you've got from 1581 to 1795, there's something called the Dutch Republic, where Catholics are persecuted. It's to play a major role in providing finance and military expertise to Cromwell during the forthcoming wars. Then you've got 1590, you've got the North Berwick witch trials, and these are all, by the way, tried by juries. And I just get slightly frustrated when people like Nicola Sturgeon start saying, there was nothing to see here. It's actually a jury trial, so perhaps there was, and it's not really a politician's job to say that the jury were all wrong in one of these trials. About 100 people were accused, and many were exonerated, but some weren't. And one of them, who wasn't exonerated, was Francis Stewart, the 5th Earl of Bothwell. And other gentry were also accused at North Berwick, which, by the way, is not that far from Rosslyn Chapel. 1593, more depopulation acts. 1597, James the 6th of Scotland publishes something called demonology, purporting to enable the identification of witches. So a lot of this is tied in with witchcraft, Martin. Just to bring you in here, the idea here is that this was something. Is there anything to see here at all? Do you think that there was any witchcraft going on, or is this just complete fantasy?
Well,
by the church, sort of propaganda. Anyway.
Well, in academic historical circles, there's a bit of a debate about this. So people like Ronald Hutton, who was at Bristol University, I think he still is at Bristol University, he tends to take the view that there was no such thing as witchcraft, but it was actually, he's interested in paganism and so on, but he doesn't see a very strong pagan influence in witchcraft, where Carlo Ginzburg, who's an Italian academic, sees witchcraft across Europe as being the remnants of paganism from before Christianization. And I think, the evidence can be construed either way. Folk beliefs in rural areas were very varied, and some of them went back a very long way, and some of them were relatively recent. And you can't necessarily generalise. I think the thing about European historians is they like grand theories, whereas in British historical circles they pretend to stick to evidence and let's not have any grand theories here. It's just a series of things that happened.
Well, I quite like grand theories too, but I do like to try and evidence them, which is what I've been trying to do here. So we've also got during this period that you've got the joining of Scotland and England. So James I of Scotland published his demonology, which says this will help you identify witches and demons. So I mean, whether he's right or not is a whole other question. But
it's very influential.
But yeah,
if the king has written a book about how to seek out witches, then you can imagine everybody's going around looking for witches.
Yeah, well, including Matthew Hopkins a little bit later. But anyway, 1603, 24th of March, James I ascends to the throne of England, whilst having been James VI of Scotland for 36 years already, uniting these two monarchies. In 1604, James I passes a stricter Witchcraft Act, that is, overthrowing Elizabeth I's lenient act, and it's enforced by self-styled Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins. So around about this time, I find it so fascinating. This stuff's all going on concurrently. Between 1604 and 1607, there are enormous anti-Enclosure revolts in Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Huntingdonshire, Leicestershire, Lincolnshire, Warwickshire, culminating in 1607 in an armed revolt under a leader with the pseudonym Captain Pouch. 40 or 50 rebels out of a ragtag army of about 1,000 peasants are shot dead at Newton by a body of mounted gentlemen with their servants, while several others are hanged and quartered. I mean, this isn't going through trials at all. This is just execution by the rich on their horses with their guns of the anti-Enclosure rioters. And 1605, during the anti-Enclosure riots, is the Gunpowder Plot, orchestrated by Lord Salisbury to test James I out and also to justify further persecution of Catholics. So then the governments in 1607 to 36, the governments of James I and Charles I set themselves against John Dee's covert empire building by pursuing an active anti-Enclosure policy. So this is in the first 4 decades or so of the 17th century. Charles I and James I both decided, no, we've got to stop enclosure. We must stop it. And they work obviously, separately because they're both individuals, but they both had pretty much the same object. Now, this all is also at the same time going on here is the 1611 publication of the King James Authorised Version of the Bible, commissioned in 1604 and recognised still as one of the most accurate translations of the Bible. So this is the first time that this authorised version has ever been available. There had been some previous Bibles, but this one was printed and distributed all over the country, so people could, for the first time, ordinary people, if they could read, could pick up and read it for themselves and say, hang on a minute, they've been saying this, look what the Bible says about that. Then 1612, the year after that, you had the Pendle witch trials up in Lancashire, culminating in 9 hangings for maleficium, causing injury by divination, and some self-confessed coven members. They were actually hanged on the 20th of August. Now this, remember, was under the more strict King James Witchcraft Act, rather than the one that we have to prove that people have actually done harm. So then in 1625, Charles I ascends to the throne. We then have the 1629, 11 years tyranny. Charles rules without Parliament. So as you can see, all this is, the Enclosure, the witch trials are all really the setting for this, the Civil War. And just before the Civil War breaks out, 3 royal anti-Enclosure commissions levy high fines on those who have been enclosing land in contravention of the Depopulation Acts. Charles I levies a total in 1600s money of £50,000. Now, around about that would be, in 2022, would be around about 2.2 billion fines levied on these landowners who've been enclosing. Well, I wonder if we had that sort of those sort of fines on big landowners today, Martin.
Well, the fact is that the landowners were stronger than anybody's attempt to prevent them doing what they wanted to do. I mean, in Thomas More's book Utopia, which came out in 1519. There was, he was criticising landowners for getting rid of people and replacing them with sheep. It was an ongoing, the modernisation, if you like, of the British economy was ongoing. And of course the wool produced by the sheep was the basis of national prosperity. So you can see this is a very strong vested interest, and they took over all the monastery lands and all the rest of it. But of course this is, the primitive accumulation that Marx talks about in Das Kapital, which leads to the possibility of a capitalist takeoff and an industrial revolution.
So, we're running forward towards the beginning of the Civil War now, and the 4th of January 1642, King Charles attempts to arrest the 5 members, John Pym, John Hampden, Arthur Hasselrig, and Denzil Hollis, and William STROUD. We now know they were already safely hidden in the City of London, which may have been tipped off by a spy at court. Charles had first gone to the House of Lords demanding they arrest the MPs for him. After a short debate, the Lords refused, and so Charles and his accompanying guard of soldiers had to go into the Commons themselves to make the arrests. Charles utters the opening line of the English Civil War, "All the birds are flown," and humiliated he leaves London. So he goes off to Oxford, and Charles raises his standard at Nottingham in August 1642, hoping the loyal aristocracy will support him against Parliament.
Can I just make the point that Charles I had to recall Parliament, because, as you know, for many years he'd ruled without Parliament, but because of the rebellion in Scotland against the prayer book by the Presbyterians who were dominant in Scottish politics, they were actually working quite closely with the Earl of Warwick and the Puritans in the English Parliament, and therefore, in order to fight the Scots, and don't forget that the Stuart dynasty originated in Scotland, they needed an English army to go north to fight the Scots, and in order to find an English army, they then had to call Parliament. And of course, when the English army was defeated by the Scots, then the Parliament demanded changes to the Constitution to give more power to Parliament, and this is when the Civil War is tipped, the English Civil War is tipped into action. But of course, it's not just about England, it's also about Scotland, and it's also about Ireland.
So, I mean, a lot of looks at the Civil War dwell on the actual battles. I'm not going to do that, but some of them were very important. The 2nd of July 1644, the Battle of Marston Moor, near York. Prince Rupert for the King took on Cromwell and Fairfax, with Edward Manchester in command. Confusion reigned on both sides, but Manchester grabbed the initiative, routing the Royalist army, inflicting crippling losses. So this was one of the first major indications of the way the war was going in 1644. In February 1645, money which proved to be decisive is spent over the winter refashioning the parliamentary army for what proved to be a decisive 1645 fighting season. This is the Parliament's new model army of 20,000 soldiers, much better equipped, disciplined and trained. This new model army, Martin, it's often talked about the Civil War. It does seem that at this stage in the war, it was decisive. Things were a little bit in the balance, 1644 and 45, but this kind of was the clincher.
That's true. And the new model army, of course, was the core of the Burford rebels, which were then crushed by Cromwell later on. And it was, it was modelled on when the English Civil War, or whatever you want to call it, the War of the Three Kingdoms is what they call it in the history books today.
Well, I don't think they do.
Some
people do.
Academic history, they call it the War of the Three Kingdoms.
They're trying to change the name of it.
Well, no. You can call it whatever you like, but academic historians call it the War of the Three Kingdoms. Well, the reason being that the war started in Scotland in the way I just explained.
It didn't really, did it?
It did. It did start in Scotland.
It started with the battle between Charles and Parliament, and that was not in Scotland.
But that was because he'd had to recall Parliament
this is
in order to
I think
fight
this is just an attempt to revise history, to confuse people.
No, it's not, Tony. All the time, we constantly reinterpret the past in terms of current debates.
But this battle between Parliament and King in London was at the heart of it.
Yes,
not
but
Scotland.
Also
these were peripheral places where this battle was being. It's a bit like saying Ukraine, is all about Ukraine. It's not. It's about much bigger powers.
That's right. So it's not just about England.
Right. So
it's about Scotland and Ireland.
Well, that's right, and it's a continuation of things that have been going on in Syria, etc.
Well,
so
the focus, a continuation of the 30 Years' War, which was in Germany, which is a struggle between Protestants and Catholics,
a struggle of
much bigger than the English Civil War.
The focus is a struggle of power between the King and Parliament, basically, and the City of London, but Parliament represented. Battle of
the narrow focus.
Naseby in 16. Well, no, it's the heart of it. 14th of June 1645, Battle of Naseby. The new model army does reasonably well. Captured though, leaving. Yeah, so Charles's forces in the Midlands are decimated there. I mean, the writing's on the wall here. Then you get to 1645 with the leveller pamphleteer John Lilburne, who's a former officer working for Cromwell. in the New Model Army was arrested. So there's people writing pamphlets saying we don't like the way this is going. They're all stuck in the Tower of London, etc. Elizabeth Lilburne, John Lilburn's wife, puts a very important women's petition to Parliament, which is thrown out by the men. And in 1646, in his memoirs, Elias Ashmole records his initiation into Freemasonry at Warrington, 60 years before Freemasonry is supposed to exist in England. Charles I loses the Battle of Newark in November 1646. And then this starts a whole series of bits where Charles is captured and then escapes. And one wonders whether, Martin, they were deliberately letting him escape to sort of almost create this thing of, well, isn't this terrible? Charles has escaped, he's on the run.
Well, I think they once they'd captured him, they really didn't know what to do with him. Because, they'd been claiming all along that they weren't against the existence of the monarchy. They just wanted it to fulfill its constitutional role and not usurp, as they saw it, the traditional liberties of the English subject, which were, things like the Norman yoke.
This all started to change. When it comes to 1648, this all started to change, didn't it? About Charles needs to be put on trial.
Well, I mean, eventually they realised that they'd gone so far that they couldn't really turn back. If they put him back in power, I think
at this point,
the problem is he was actually negotiating with the parliamentary representatives, but at the same time he was negotiating with the Irish, the French, and anybody else, the Scots.
That will listen.
In order to try and get basically he wasn't negotiating in good faith.
So the point here is that Cromwell and the parliamentarians are starting to realise, well, if the king survives this and carries on as king, he's going to have our guts for garters.
That's right. They said the problem we've got, I'll have to paraphrase it, it's we can win every battle, and yet if he wins one, he is still king and we're all to hang. But if we have to win every battle, if we don't get rid of him, it's like getting rid of Somoza in Nicaragua in 1979. If you don't kill him, he's going to come back.
So, yeah, a bit of a problem at that point. So anyway, in September 1648, there's a pamphlet called The Freemasons Crushed, or Les Francs-Maçons Écrasés, published nearly a century later. The French Catholic Abbé Larudan alleges in September 1648 that Cromwell, realising his own life will be forfeit if negotiations for peace with Charles proceed, forms a cell to push through the execution of Charles. Now, he's saying this is a kind of Masonic cell, / witchcraft cell. The idea is a secret society under a Masonic guise. The inauguration takes place in King Street, St James in London, over 2 evening meetings, 4 days apart. And there's a whole load of people who are present. And now, what he's doing there is he's got all factions in the army and in Parliament present there. And the idea is that these people who are part of this plot will report back to Cromwell over the next few months on everybody's views. And this is actually, what it does is it informs something which happens a little bit later in 1648, which is Pride's Purge. First, on the 1st of December, the House of Commons resists Ireton's calls to proceed to try the king. They vote by 129 to 83, a majority of 46, to accept the king's terms. This is all looking bad for Cromwell. But anyway, the next day, the New Model Army occupies London and arrests 41 MPs who were most actively supporting the king. And on the 6th of December 1648, we have Pride's Purge, acting on orders from Cromwell's son-in-law, General Henry Ireton, and apparently unknown to Army Chief General Fairfax. Thomas Pride, Colonel, surrounds Parliament with troops and purges Parliament of a further 100 or so MPs who voted to negotiate with Charles. This leaves only 71 out of the original nearly 500 MPs still sitting, the so-called Rump Parliament. So then they have a vote, and they vote to try the king. On the 4th of January 1649, Parliament proposed the king be tried for treason. Only 46 of the Rump Parliament's 71 MPs turn up to vote, and 26 vote in favour of a majority of 6. And on the 20th of January 1649, a court's convened in Westminster Hall, and Charles I is charged with waging war on Parliament. And he's found guilty, and subsequently on the 30th of January, outside the old palace of Whitehall, Charles I is executed. So, so they're in the clear now, Martin, it looks like, and they're going to have to decide what they're going to do, because they knew that Charles was going to come for them, but now he's gone.
Yes, but as you say, they didn't know exactly what they were going to do. I mean, you can do that, but then the question is, well, what are you going to do next?
Well, the next month, they arrest leveller pamphleteers because people are up in arms about this. They're writing about it all over the country. John Lilburn, William Wallin, Overton and Thomas Prince are arrested on the Wednesday, the 28th of March, 1649. Cromwell launches his a project on the Council of State. That is to say, if you do not break them, they will break you, he says, yea, and bring all the guilt and the blood of the treasure shed and spent in this kingdom on your heads and shoulders. And he proposes all 4 prisoners are committed to the Tower. I mean, he wins in the Council of State by 1 vote. The Council of State is now running the country. It's effectively a military dictatorship. And there are petitions for the release of the levellers come in on the 1st and the 18th of April, 10,000 people signing them, 10,000 signatures from women. These petitions go to the Rump Parliament. But, of course, the Rump Parliament really is just the supporters of Cromwell. So the Agreement of the People is published by the levellers on the 1st of May, 1649. And then we have, in May 1649, the Levellers' Day, which I went along to this year in Burford in Oxfordshire. Wages unpaid and refusing to fight in Ireland. Hundreds of parliamentary leveller soldiers sack their officers in Burford. And then they're surrounded by Cromwell and his troop and executed. 3 of them executed outside the church. So we then, after the Civil War, come to the golden age of piracy. Now, this is a long time. This is 1650 to 1720, but the British secret state's sponsorship of pirates is denied, of course. You know, they say, the Royals say it's nothing to do with us. And the Royal Navy's state within a state works very hard to fulfil John Dee's vision for Britain's dominance of the high seas. So isn't it a shame? It's like, you know, when we say to the poor old Spanish, one of your galleons has been taken over by some pirates. What a shame. Accidents can happen, Martin. Yeah,
and if you think about that timeline that you just said, it's starting with the Navigation Acts, which were passed by the parliamentary government, you know, the Republican government, which said that ships trading to England had to be English ships. And it was a kind of protectionist measure, and it led to conflicts with the Dutch, for example, who weren't happy with it. And it is very much the era of the creation of the initial creation of the British Empire. But of course, it continued under the Restoration under Charles II. So you know the direction of travel was now clear. And then gradually they established their control over large parts of the earth.
So, 3rd of September 1651, we have the Battle of Worcester, which is Charles II, Charles I's son, coming from Scotland with a small army, and he loses, but he goes on the run until the 15th of October 1651 for 43 days, and the military government and the Puritan, the Roundhead soldiers are searching for him all over the country, eventually makes it over to France. And this is really why this Freemasons crushed pamphlet in France is so important, because almost all the disaffected Cavaliers were making their way over to France around Henrietta Maria, who was Charles I's wife. She was based in Paris, and so they were all going over there and sharing all their knowledge about what they thought had been going on over here. Then you have the Bare Bones Parliament, which started on the 20th of April 1653. Parliament is really in a terrible state, and everyone is saying, well, you need to have a completely new election, but the army don't want to do that. There's an uprising in Wiltshire, for example, in March 1655, which is put down by Colonel John Penruddock. He's doing the uprising. Cromwell is doing the putting down. But Cromwell himself is put down on the 3rd of September 1658. He dies aged 59, just exactly a year after this so-called, 10 years, a decade after this so-called plot to execute Charles, I mentioned earlier, from the Freemasons' crushed pamphlet. So you have the restoration of Charles II in 1660. Then you have something called the Rye House Plot, which I won't go into. Then 5th of November, William of Orange, 1688, William of Orange lands in Torbay with 14,000 soldiers and 5,000 horses. It's called the Glorious Revolution. It's really a coup d'etat, and it follows as James II is forced into exile in Ireland, while the Protestant William III, King Billy, takes the English throne. This also begins the Catholic Jacobite movement, which is committed to restoring the Stuart line. What happened with the Jacobites, Martin? So there was a kind of resentment about this Glorious Revolution for many, many decades afterwards.
Well, in 1715, the Old Pretender, which was James...
Bonnie Prince Charlie.
Yeah, well, Bonnie Prince Charlie was 1745.
Oh, was it? Oh,
he
later.
was the young
Okay.
Pretender. The Old Pretender was his father, James II, but of course he wasn't. Once he'd been deposed, he wasn't James II anymore.
Right. He says he was
but,
over in Ireland.
The Stuart line remained a threat to the new regime.
So what happened in 1715? Was it you said?
Well, that was the first uprising against the new order, you know, the orange order, if you like.
God, not the Orange Order again.
Well, I mean, because the Orange Order, this is where the Orange Order comes from. It's from this era in Ireland.
They're a little bit like the Masons too, aren't they?
Well, I mean, lots of organisations share similar structures. You know, if you look at an organogram of any organisation, you will see that there's a lot of similarities. Most armies look quite similar for obvious reasons.
So Great Britain comes into being in 1707, and that is after the passage of the Treaty of Union with Scotland. And in 1737, Andrew Ramsay reveals the 33 degrees of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. This is something I only came across this week, so named because no degree had ever been issued against the Templars by Scottish monarchs, banning the Templars. 1737 that was, and then we had, as Martin referred to there, Bonnie Prince Charlie as abortive Jacobite rebel march on London, where they got to Derby, Chris Williamson's hometown, who we'll be hearing from a bit later, the former Labour MP, and went back to Scotland. So my conclusion really is that Charles isn't simply dealing with just a faction of merchants, but it's also a sort of spiritual battle he's been fighting because of the getting rid of the Pope, getting rid of the Vatican. Suddenly, the British have got to take on all the responsibility for everything to do with the Church. So it's a sort of double-edged sword. You're saying, well, we've had enough of the Pope, but suddenly you've got to take it all on, and they weren't necessarily up to the job.
Well, it was Henry VIII who became the head of the Church of England, the first head of the Church of England. And of course, that in Scotland, the Reformation was rather different. It was more, bottom up rather than top down. And of course, it's all reflecting what was going on the continent of Europe, the 30 Years' War. And of course, James I's daughter married Prince Frederick of the Palatinate, who was actually the person who tried to invade Bohemia, which began the 30 Years' War. So Prince Rupert of the Rhine had fought in the Protestant cause in the 30 Years' War. So the Stuart dynasty, although it was Church of England, they had very strong Catholic tendencies, and of course Charles II died as, on his deathbed he converted, and James II was even more straightforward. He was a Catholic, and of course to a lot of the Protestant gentry who benefited from the dissolution of the monasteries and supported Parliament during the Civil War, the idea of a Catholic monarch was unthinkable. And of course, it's still the case that a Catholic cannot be the King or Queen of England, and that's on the statute book.
Anyway, I find, looking at this in the context of the attempts to get an empire going, to evict loads of people from the land, to turn Britain into the first country where it's possible to do mass urbanisation, industrial revolution, where you're producing loads of ships, which happened after the Civil War, and all sorts of war equipment to take the world over, to actually sit the Civil War in that context, as well as this context of witch trials, witchcraft, Freemasonry, the Templars, I found fascinating, and it was quite a challenge over a year or so really to pull this together and to try and turn it into something which is, be very, very happy for people to criticise it, but at least I feel satisfied that I've got my thoughts in order. So there is a reading list as well with this article, which I'll be publishing in the next couple of days. I'll put a link up to it on our show page later at thisweek.org.uk. One is by Dennis Wheatley, the novelist, and also he was a deception planner during the Second World War. That's called Old Rowley, which is a non-fiction book of his about the private life of Charles II, which I found absolutely riveting, rip-roaring read. And it's all about the Restoration, which of course was a fantastic time for the arts. Once King Charles II had been restored, lots and lots of Restoration comedies where King Charles II would go along to the theatre and watch people taking the mickey out of him and roar with laughter. That's the kind of attitude we need, which we don't really seem to have in Britain today. It's almost like we've got a new Puritanism, kind of political correctness. And another one of the books is The Levellers and the English Revolution by Henry Brailsford. Do you want to say something about him, Martin? Because he's quite an important figure,
he's another one of that post-war generation of historians who, resurrected the idea of the English Civil War, or the War of the Three Kingdoms, whatever you want to call it, as a revolutionary movement. Because, of course, the tendency was, in establishment circles, to simply see the Civil War and the Republic as an aberration. Yeah, if you look at the more conservative history books I was handed as a child, it was regarded as an aberration, and then of course we got back to normal.
No, it was surely the Civil War was when we actually got proper democracy and a parliament rather than the king being in charge.
Well, yes,
but it put the king in his place. This is the way certainly we were taught about the Civil War.
Yes,
the Civil War put the king in his place. This is what's called
Whig history, and of course in 1066 and all that, Sellar and Yeatman, the famous quote was the Royalists right but romantic. The Roundheads wrong but revolting. Right but revolting.
But there's one
wrong but romantic.
Particularly good book, I think, about the Civil War, which I came across. Edmund Ludlow and the English Civil War, edited by Jane Shooter, published in 1994. Fascinating account of a parliamentary commander who finds himself slowly losing faith in the cause for which he's been fighting, and a really good accounts by brilliant writer he was, and he's pointing out all the things. Well, hang on, this guy Cromwell is turning out to be even worse than the king. And then Born in Blood, The Lost Secrets of Freemasonry by John J. Robinson. Thank you for one of the listeners, must be probably 2 years ago or so now, for emailing me and saying this is a good book to have a look at. And it certainly was. Extraordinary historical exploration of previously hidden origins of 18th century Freemasonry in ancient and medieval secret societies.
Can I just mention another book in relation to this period, which I read twice during the Brexit standoff in Parliament, which is called The Noble Revolt. I can't remember who wrote it, but it's a relatively recent book, and it's based upon archival stuff which was not available previously.
So the revolt being the Civil War?
Yes, because it was actually orchestrated by the Earl of Warwick, descendant of Warwick the Kingmaker, and various,
the Wars of the Roses,
Puritan inclined. And they basically were in cahoots with the Scots in order to try and bring down Charles I. And there's a lot of detail in that book. It's quite a big book, about how that actually happened, and how the actual, the actual final run into the Civil War. It's not about the Civil War, it's about the run into it.
There's little doubt, is there, that King Billy was a usurper?
Well, I mean, there's what's it they say? Treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? For if treason doth prosper, then none dare call it treason. So, in other words, once you've usurped and taken over, William I was a usurper. It doesn't matter, does it? Once you've won, you're the regime.
Well, I don't know how it's going in Ukraine. It doesn't seem to be going too well. Anyway, The World Turned Upside Down is my 5th book of the 6. That's by Christopher Hill in 1972. He published that detailed analysis of the 17th century counterculture, centred around the Protestant Reformation and agricultural reforms. And finally, The Witch Cult in Western Europe by Margaret Murray, 1921, a study of the underground persistence of secret Canaanite and Phoenician religious cults under the surface of Gentile modern European society. So that's basically it. It's called Enclosure for Empire, Witchcraft, Freemasonry and Oliver Cromwell. But the real title is The Bankrupt Brewer of Huntingdon and Solomon's Temple, an untold story of the English Civil War. Solomon's Temple, of course, is very important today, Martin, isn't it? It's a focus over in Jerusalem still, and there's still these attempts by the Third Temple groups in Israel to rebuild that Third Temple. Amazing that some of this sort of links back right the way back to the times of Cromwell.
Well, right the way back to the times of Jesus. I mean, in a sense, everything in history is connected to everything else, because it just is, isn't it?
What there is also something probably worth mentioning, which I came across recently, which was people talking about the idea of rebuilding Solomon's Temple as the idea of your body is your temple, rebuilding the body. So this links in, potentially anyway, with transhumanism and the idea of, well, we can just redesign humans to live forever and this sort of thing.
Well, those are very big topics. I mean, all sorts of things. You know, human culture is incredibly fecund. There's all sorts of new ideas constantly bubbling up, and they're connected to old ideas reinterpreted. You know, there's always room for discussion of all these things, but don't presume that everything is just explained by one simple explanation. That's what modern historians are very aware of, how there's a lot of contingency in history.
I'm just thinking
things might have been different, but they weren't.
Thinking about today's show. It's a bit past, present, and future. We've just been in the past. We're going to go on to the present in a moment.
Go down, Moses!